My name is Micah Vandegrift. I'm an MA student in the American and Florida Studies program. There's other stuff going on in New York around the same time that hip-hop was getting started. So the way I kind of want to frame this is talk about some of the correlations between hip-hop in the 70s and early 80s and the punk stuff that was kind of growing there at the same time. Anyone feel like they could draw us a little picture of the New York City area right quick? Kind of help. Go ahead. Yeah, come on up.
Nice.
Kind of helps so we can see where things are happening at the same time. One of the first correlations between hip hop and punk stuff that was happening is this sense of place. Give me Manhattan. This is just.
Oh wow, you're
just
good.
A little better than I would drive, right?
This is quick.
That's Queens, right?
And
Yeah.
Brooklyn down here. Whatever that is.
Staten Island.
Right?
The sands of the Shaolin. Is it really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Ooh.
One of the important things about punk, and I think it's echoed in hip hop as well, is this sense of place, this sense of being from somewhere, being connected to the place where you're at. So you know, a lot of the early hip hop stuff, if I know my history, is happening up here in the Bronx, right? The main area for the punk and post-punk and all that kind of stuff that was happening was in this the East Village, Greenwich Village, down here in South Manhattan. But the reason that it was centered here was, you can look all the way back to the 60s. John Cage, and there was a bunch of, the New York Art School was happening there, the Velvet Underground, all kinds of stuff was happening in the late 60s that was centered on that area in South Manhattan. And so there was this avant-garde feeling that was going on there. And you know, as punk developed from Iggy Pop and on to Britain and to the Ramones in New York, they started to focus on this area right here, CBGB's. Anyone ever heard of CBGB's? It's a club, famous punk club located down in that area. Okay, so there's this sense of place, and in you know, in punk and post-punk we call that a scene. A scene is usually made up of a couple bands. You know, an audience of people who are part of that, a sort of fashion, you know, and the connection between these two, the two subcultures we're talking about, is the connection with art, like specific, you know, pictorial art or whatever in the beginning. I read through that chapter that you all had to read, the Zulus and the Time Bomb, and talking about how a lot of the hip hop stuff was focused, especially in New York in this time period, was focused around the graffiti artists, right? So people were going around and tagging things, and this is how they were marking their territory. Punk started to branch off into these other, you know, subcategories: new wave, no wave, and some of these are mentioned in your chapter. But a lot of this early new wave and no wave stuff was based in performance art. There's a guy named Glenn Branca who was basically a composer. He was a classical composer who decided he was going to start composing music for electric guitar. And so he would form these you know, huge 300 guitar choruses, and he would compose a piece, and they would play the electric guitar, and it was all feedback and noise and ridiculousness. But that's the kind of thing that was okay to happen in New York at this time. What it produces is a sense of community. One of the guys was saying that he had heard in order for a culture to be legitimate, it had to have its own music, its own fashion, and a dance.
Yeah, it was Fat Five Freddy, right?
Yeah, I think it was. And that was very true for the post-punk and punk stuff that was happening at the same time. It had a music, it had a fashion, and the dance was, you know, a bunch of crazy kids running in a circle, punching each other out, but it was a dance, right? For punk, the way it was the t-shirt and jeans. This became the uniform for punk rock, and it was started with there's a guy named Richard Hell, who was, I don't think that's his real name, Richard Hell, a member of the band named Television, 77, New York City. His most popular song is called "I Belong to a Blank Generation," and that's the way, you know, that's the way they started to dress. They were, you know, it was just a plain t-shirt, plain jeans, Converse All-Stars, whatever, and this was picked up by the Ramones. Exact same thing happening with punk. If we're going to think about punk fashion, right off the top of your head, what do you got? Punk fashion. What's it look like?
Mohawks.
Mohawks, good.
Doc Martin.
Doc Martens, good.
Leather.
Leather, I got my leather jacket over here. That's because I ride a motorcycle. I'm not trying to be anything.
But also metal. Like there was always metal involved with the leather or with the whatever they were.
Right. Both of these subcultures started to experiment with were electronics, electronic music, was just getting started. You know, technology was just really getting started around that time. For the punk, you know, if you're familiar with, I know you had some Blondie to listen to for today. Blondie was a new wave artist, you know, coming out of this punk thing and using electronics to create her music. Well, the use of new instruments. If we're going to talk about new instruments in hip hop, what would we say that they are? What is the new instrument in early hip hop? What are they using?
Turntables.
Turntables, right? This was not the way that turntables were meant to be used. Just breaking all these needles and stuff like that, right? Same sort of thing was happening with the punk in the late 70s and early 80s. There was a band called the Sonic Youth that formed in 1981 from the Lower Manhattan area, and they were picking up on some of this American classical trend of prepared instruments. They were using prepared instruments. What they would do is they would take their guitar, if you're familiar with the guitar strings, and they would stick a screwdriver in there and then just play it like this, just to see what kind of noises they can make. There's also this sense of authenticity, this sense of this music or this culture or whatever, this belongs to us, and it does not belong to them. There's a separation of we are this thing and they are that thing. Common enemy. What about that? If we're talking about hip hop and punk, post-punk in the early 80s, if there were to be a common enemy, who would that be?
NYPD.
NYPD, sure.
Right, the man.
The man. Wrote that, the man, in quotes on here. If the man had a name in 1981, who would that be? And the reason why was, Reagan was running on this platform, and this is his famous phrase, it's morning in America again, right? And for a lot of people, especially people living in New York in the late 70s, early 80s, this was not the case. It was not morning in America. Things were bad. The streets were hard. Bronx was, not a place most people wanted to be. South Manhattan, dirty, a bunch of kids running around with no money, doing drugs, all kinds of stuff. So the common enemy between the two subcultures is something that has started to unite them. It's a perfect storm of events. Reagan in the White House, social unrest across the country. New York had just become, it was the 60s or whatever, New York had just become this capital of American culture for whatever reason. And so these two things just popped up at the same time in the same place. And then when they did start to interact with like Curtis Blow and Debbie Harry, the Beastie Boys, founded in '79 as a hardcore punk band, switched their style. They were still kind of playing their own instruments, but started rapping in '86 or whenever. The music that was happening in New York at the time were subcultures and countercultures that were positioning themselves in opposition to the mainstream. They did not want to be a part of this thing, and it was an idea that they had to wrestle with over the rest of their time. And we talk about hip hop today, or even punk today. It's part of the popular culture, whether we like it or not. In the early 80s, there was no way that this was going to become part of the popular culture. This was something that belonged in New York, belonged to these kids. As far as the racial angle, there's this really important connection for hardcore punk. There's a specific genre of punk, as we're moving down the line here, called hardcore. One of the earliest hardcore bands was a band by the name of Bad Brains. And Bad Brains, Washington, D.C., late 70s, it was 4 black guys. And they were the first hardcore band who inspired all these young white kids in D.C. or Southern California to start bands. And it was 4 black guys who knew how to play their instruments, but decided that this was, they were a rock band before, but they decided that this was the music that moved them the most. Playing faster, playing louder, being able to jump around and jump on the crowd. They say that HR, the lead singer for Bad Brains, invented stage diving and moshing and all these sort of things. The race issue, it was complicated, but it was interesting. As the skinhead movement started to rise, late 80s, early 90s, a counter movement came up. It was called Sharps, Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. So there were the Sharps running around too. So race has always been an issue, especially when you get down to you break culture down to all these different subcultures. The issues kind of get more magnified.
Both were oppressed, marginalized communities.
Right.
Both were identityless and forgotten by the man and by the system that controlled things. Both were seemingly powerless as culturally and in the direction of their community, and that was a frustrating place to be.